Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, Director of Professional Development for the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, and we are so happy to have you as part of today's conversation. Throughout the webinar today, your camera and microphone are disabled, so we can't see or hear you. But as many of your classmates have already done, we love to hear from you. Please feel free to send your greetings in through the chat. And as the presentation goes, your comments and your questions. I'm joined by my co-host, Cynthia Williams, who's our Assistant Dean for Community Partnerships. And Cynthia will be in the chat, making notes of your comments and questions. And then when we reach the end of the presentation, she'll be helping to represent your voice in the room and in the conversation with Dr. Wingfield. So before we get started with today's program, I just want to let you know what we have still coming up yet this week. Tomorrow, Thursday, 12:30. Brown School alum Nikki Dowdy is going to be giving a presentation called Education in the Era of COVID. She's head of school at City Academy here in St. Louis, and she'll be sharing sort of lessons learned as they are striking the balance between providing educational service and meeting the rest of the needs of the kiddos and families they serve. And then we'll be taking next week off for Thanksgiving and returning with force in December to deliver more programming. So now it's my great honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield is the Mary Tilston Hemingway Professor of Arts and Sciences. She's also Associate Dean for Faculty Development here at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research examines how and why racial and gender inequity persists in professional occupations. In addition to academic scholarship, Professor Wingfield has written for mainstream outlets like Slate, The Atlantic, Vox, and Harvard Business Review. Her most recent book is Flatlining, Race, Work, and Healthcare in the New Economy, and that won the 2019 C. Wright Mills Award. So she's here to share some of the insights from that work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield.
Thank you so much, Janet, for that kind introduction. And thank you to you and Cynthia for inviting me to give this presentation on my work. I'm happy to be here and share some of my research with everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can take a look at the presentation that will accompany what I'm discussing. Okay, so hopefully you should see the front page of a PowerPoint slideshow that says professional work in a post-racial era, Black healthcare workers in the new economy. So this presentation is based on, as Jen just mentioned, my most recent book, which is called Flatlining, Race, Work, and Health in the New Economy. And that book is an attempt to try to study and understand some of the ways that changes to work are having an impact on Black professional workers. Most of my research has focused on questions related to these areas in one way or another. I've done work that's looked at Black men who are working as nurses, as well as Black men who are working as doctors, lawyers, engineers, and in the financial services industry. I've also done work that's looked at Black professional workers in various occupations, both Black men and Black women, to try to understand the types of emotion management and emotional performance that they do in these environments. But this project was born out of me wanting to kind of take a step back and take a bigger look at how major changes to how we work and to our economic structures and to the ways those changes had an impact on organizations were shaping the experiences that Black professionals had in these settings. So that's just the context for a little bit of the project. To say more, I think it's useful to identify the transition and the changes between what work used to be and what work looks like today. So when we think about what work used to be, I think we often have a pretty idealized vision of this post-World War II in particular, work world. And in that image of what work used to look like, this is a time period where many workers had a lot of job security. There was very little turnover and transition in jobs as well. People were likely to work for one company for the duration of their careers. They could count on health benefits and health insurance covered by those companies in many cases. There was a robust middle management sector so that people could accelerate and advance through a company, staying with that company again for their career, and count on the company being a place that offered opportunities for upward mobility and advancement. So when we think about these idealized days of what work used to look like, it's a pretty rosy picture. And I think when we hear people talking about growing the middle class, or revisiting this idea of work being secure and stable. Often I think this is the era that they are thinking of. Of course, we also have to acknowledge that when we have this picture of this post-war work world, it's one that came about in large part because of occupational segregation. Everyone didn't have access to these jobs. They were primarily available to white able-bodied men. And it's also an era where the public sector played a really important and significant part in creating access to these jobs in the first place. Public education was heavily subsidized by federal and state governments. The cost associated with higher education and credentialing was much lower than it is today. So we had an environment where work was a lot more stable. It was a lot more consistent, predictable, and reliable. It was so for a part of the population, and it was so as a consequence of a contract between organizations, management, and the public sector that really took responsibility for maintaining a lot of the costs associated with training this workforce. So what does work look like today? We have a really different picture if we think about today's work and how that's structured. For one thing, we know that declining unionization has been a factor for probably the last 30 to 40 years. Private sector workers are less likely to belong to a union than they were at pretty much any point in the previous 30 or 40 years as a consequence of the union decline. Workers also experience a lot less job security. The favorable spin on this is that organizations promote or are encouraged to look for people who are nimbler and more mobile in their job search, which one argument of which is that that offers workers more autonomy and self-direction, so that workers are freer to leave a job and to pursue other positions and less likely to be attached to one corporation or one organization for the duration of their careers. Organizations are also a lot flatter. That level of middle management that I spoke about before is largely gone. People are more likely to seek mobility by changing jobs, and people change jobs much more frequently than they did in previous eras as well. Organizations are also a lot more, workers are a lot more responsible for benefits than they had been in previous eras as well. As anyone who's fortunate enough to have some retirement insurance or health insurance through their job knows, frequently, each year, people are expected to take on a little bit more of that responsibility. The organization pays less, the individual worker ends up paying more and more. In cases where people used to be guaranteed pensions by virtue of work at a certain position, a certain organization, often through state governments, in many cases, those pensions have disappeared, and state governments are less likely to pay into pensions that they owe workers in many cases. We also know that organizations now offer a lot more stated support for diversity. And this is a major change from where organizations were in previous eras. Whereas many organizations could and did openly discriminate along the lines of race and gender, organizations now are a lot more likely to say that they do want to support diversity and that this is something that they value and that they believe in. But at the same time, the pathways into work and the jobs in which workers are likely to be employed are a lot less secure than they have been in previous eras. So what that shows us is that there's largely a frayed contract between organizations and employees. The type of symbiotic relationship that I mentioned on the previous slide really is a lot less present in today's economy. And this has created a lot more economic and emotional uncertainty for many workers as they try to navigate an environment where they are much more responsible for shouldering a lot of burdens and changes on their own. And they do so without necessarily being able to rely on public sector support or organizational support for these changes. So sociologists and some economists will refer to this new state of being as the new economy. And in the new economy, professional work is one of few routes to economic security. When we think about how work has changed and how workers have largely been left behind in many cases by the shifts that are occurring in our workforce and in our organizations, professional work is one of the few areas where workers can still count on some level of economic stability, some level of job security to some degree, and even that's changed a lot over time. But professional work largely benefits from technological advances that have happened over time and the growth of the knowledge economy. Professional work is also likely to be the focus of diversity dialogue, where organizations, again, will emphasize the importance of or their belief in wanting to see more racial and gender diversity among their workforce. So the big question that framed this book for me was thinking about what this new economy means for Black professionals. If we know, for example, that the way that we work has changed, and if we know that the structural and economic underpinnings around work have shifted dramatically in ways that leave workers less secure and less stable and more emotionally and economically fragile. But we also know that many organizations, in the wake of these changes, say that they want to attract more workers of color and that they want to be more racially diverse. I wanted to get a sense of what this shifting new economy means for Black professionals who are employed in one of the few areas where there's still some economic security in the new economy, even as that economic security has still itself become a lot more tenuous and a lot more uncertain. What does it mean to be employed in the workforce when organizations say that they are more attractive, that they want to attract more workers of color, even as the pathways towards professional work have become more shaky? There's some existing research that gives some insights into what we might expect to find. For example, my colleagues George Wilson, Vinny Rossino, and Matt Huffman have argued that Black workers, Black men workers in particular, are likely to experience a lot of downward mobility as the public sector privatizes. And so what they've been able to show is that as the public sector has increasingly been overtaken by private companies who now contract with federal and state, excuse me, with state and local governments to provide services that the public sector used to be able to offer, one consequence of this has been that many Black men find themselves with fewer routes and access to jobs that previously would have provided middle-class standards of employment. So as we see the public sector shrinking, as we see increasing privatization of that public sector, a consequence of that has been the reorganization of economic life and stability for African-American families, particularly for Black men who would have counted on public sector employment as a mainstay for economic stability. We also know that despite organizations' statements about their support for racial diversity, many organizations have actually failed to realize this in practice. Sharon Collins and Frank Dobbin have noted this over time and argued that organizations' focus on wanting more racial diversity has not really yielded results for a variety of reasons. And that while organizations may say that this is something that matters to them, they have not necessarily been able to translate that interest and that will into measurable, achievable results. And finally, my colleague here at WashU, Jake Rosenfeld, has shown that declining unionization actually exacerbates racial wage inequality, in as much as with fewer and fewer people joining unions that have the capacity to push for more equitability and higher wages for workers, a consequence of that has been that racial wage inequality that already exists has widened and worsened over time. So these studies give us some interesting insights about how we might expect Black professionals to fare in the new economy. This work suggests that the public sector, which previously had been a source of steady employment for Black workers, may not be as much of one anymore. This work suggests that organizations may not necessarily, excuse me, be able to achieve their stated goals of more racial diversity, and that workers who are Black may experience growing wage inequality as a consequence of declining unionization in these settings. But these studies also leave a lot of unanswered questions about how Black professionals deal with work transformation. In other words, this research gives us insights about the structural shifts that are happening and how they could potentially be reproducing racial inequality. They don't tell us as much about how Black workers live in these organizations and how they are responding to these changes and what impact these changes are having on their decisions and their strategies and their approaches to work. So for example, we know that the privatization of the public sector is having an impact on Black men's employment outcomes and opportunities. We don't know if that means that Black workers are more likely to seek out private sector employment as a consequence of the shrinking public sector. We know that organizations are largely failing at their efforts to increase racial diversity. We don't know what that means for whether and how Black workers seek to use or take advantage of existing programs around racial diversity that may still exist in these workplaces. We know that declining unionization is exacerbating racial wage inequality. We don't know if that leads Black workers to want to push for or be more involved with enhancing unions or growing union membership as a way of addressing these inequalities, or if they attribute these racial wage inequalities to other attributes. So what I hope to do with this book was to fill in some of those gaps and to try to address some of the questions that I still had about what it meant to deal with these kinds of changes as a Black professional worker in a changing society. So the core questions that drive the study overall were to ask, what does the new economy mean for Blacks doing professional work? As industries in the new economy become more privatized, stratified, and unequal, where and how do Black professionals fall? What are their challenges? What are their opportunities? Who are the winners and losers in this new economy and in this setting? Focusing the questions in this way highlighted for me that the healthcare industry struck me as pretty much an ideal space in which to try to answer these questions and to understand these issues. And this is so for a variety of reasons. For one thing, if we look at how the new economy has emerged over time, one of the things that we see is that many industries become very stratified and split, where there are certain opportunities for small groups of people who are able to access private sector services, and far fewer opportunities for those who are unable to access those private sector services. And certainly healthcare falls into that bucket. We know, for example, in the healthcare system today, that certainly there are two systems of healthcare that are not necessarily very equal in terms of resources and opportunities and what they provide. There is a private system where well-off, healthy, responsible patients are able to access private facilities. They can use private insurance and they can get the best care that they can afford. And for everyone else, there's a public system that includes minimally funded public sector care for those who aren't able to afford or aren't able to access this private system of insurance. So healthcare certainly manifests as an example of this tiered system in the wake of a new economy where public sector resources are shrinking and underfunded. This change is also emerging in tandem with changes in the US's racial demographics. We know that the US has become increasingly racially diverse over the past several decades and is poised to become more racially diverse going forward. So at the same time that we're seeing this tiered system of healthcare, we are also seeing increasing diversity among US racial demographics. We are seeing more and more people of color who may be served by one of these systems of healthcare, the private or the public, depending on where they fall economically. And we also know that in the healthcare system, these changes to the system becoming more stratified are also occurring as routes to professional work have become less stable, meaning that the funding available for credentialing in the healthcare system has changed significantly. There are fewer routes for people to be able to access the training and the funding specifically for that training that they need in order to become qualified healthcare professionals. So we see that the routes to being part of this healthcare system are affected by changes in the new economy, as are the demographic changes that are reshaping our population at large. So this is just a little bit of data on where Black professionals fall in the healthcare system that's changing under these strictures. It probably won't surprise many of you to see that when we look at where Black professionals are represented, they're least likely to be represented among the physician population, which is the highest status position in this list of occupations, the one that requires the most credentialing and training, and the hardest one to achieve as a result of that. Black workers are still underrepresented as emergency medical technicians and paramedics and as physician assistants. They are somewhat more represented as diagnostic related technicians and as registered nurses, although they still fall under their representation in the US population. And we started to see some parity among some levels of technical workers, health practitioner support techs, for example, medical and clinical lab techs, and medical records and health info techs. We actually see Black workers overrepresented relative to their presence in the population as licensed practical nurses, but again, not so much as registered nurses. So I'll just add here as a kind of a fun fact, when I was researching my last book, which focused on Black men in predominantly male-dominated occupations, I learned that in the year 1900, the population of Black men working as physicians was about 2.2%. In 2000, the population of Black men working as physicians was about 2.3%. So over that entire century, the population has barely moved of Black physicians. And that's true for Black women doctors as well. There's been virtually no mobility in that particular area, and Black workers continue to be incredibly underrepresented in that field, to the point where that number and that shift has not really changed in a significantly long period of time, and leaves these workers very much underrepresented relative to their presence in the population. So the way that I'll focus the remainder of this presentation is to focus on one aspect of work transformation in the new economy. I'll talk today about diversity ideology in particular. And I mentioned this as one example of how work transformation in the new economy has occurred. Organizations have changed, the economy has changed, structural dynamics have changed to make work more slippery and harder to access and more unstable for many people. But as I mentioned, among professional occupations, We also are a lot more likely to see organizations saying that they want to focus more on diversity of many kinds. And this has become particularly mainstream in medicine and nursing. Among professional organizations representing both doctors and nurses, many of these organizations, including the American Medical Association, the American Nursing Association, are much more likely to say now that they recognize and realize that more diversity in these professions is critical and important, particularly as our population demographics begin to shift, and especially as we are facing a nursing shortage and a growing population of patients of color. So diversity ideology is pretty much mainstream in the medical profession and healthcare professions. It's not unusual. It's not weird to talk about. It's not a thing that no one says or that mainstream organizations shy away from. What I was curious about and what I focus on in this presentation is the impact that this mainstreaming of this kind of ideology and that aspect of structural change has on Black professionals. How do they respond to this aspect of work that's become, how do they respond to this particular aspect of work that has changed, and this idea that discussing and talking about more, wanting to achieve more diversity has now become more commonplace and baseline. In order to address these questions, I did intensive semi-structured interviews with 75 healthcare workers. These workers included doctors, nurses, physician assistants, and technicians. Interviews generally ran from 1 to 2 hours, somewhere in that time frame, depending on how much the respondent wanted to share and how much time that they had. And I coupled the interviews with data from the American Panel Survey, which is a quarterly survey that WashU was running at the time that reached a representative sample of 2,000 adults. On top of that, I also did field observations in 3 settings to get a sense of what the day-to-day experiences of Black healthcare workers really looked like, and to see for myself and to get additional supplemental data about what this experience was like on the ground level. So I was able to spend time shadowing a Black woman maternal and fetal medicine doctor who was affiliated with the university hospital. I spent time with a Black man who was affiliated with a public hospital in their emergency medicine department. And I spent time with a Black woman pediatrician who was a partner in a private practice. And so each of these field observations gave a lot more important and interesting insights to flesh out some of the things that respondents told me about in the interviews. So moving on to the findings. Interestingly, what I learned from my project was that in many cases, diversity initiatives left Black professionals feeling apathetic, indifferent, in some cases even annoyed. Counter to what we might expect, they generally did not support these initiatives. They were not on board. They were not big fans of the initiatives that were being enacted in most of their facilities. Now, this was not because they didn't believe in diversity. It wasn't that they felt that it didn't matter. It wasn't that they felt that it was unimportant or irrelevant to the work that they were doing. But rather, most respondents told me that the diversity efforts that were present in their workplaces largely did not reflect their racial work experiences. There was a vast disconnect between what organizations were doing in their stated efforts to try to create more racial diversity and what respondents were actually experiencing on a day-to-day level in ways that they felt organizations could help and could change, but were not, because their programming was not designed to focus on that. Now, this varies by occupational status, so that the experiences that I heard about from doctors were very different from what I heard from nurses, which were then very different from what I heard from technicians. And these experiences varied by gender, which meant that even among occupational categories, what I heard from Black women in nursing, for example, was not necessarily synonymous from what I heard from Black men in nursing, and the same with Black workers who were doctors and with technicians. So I'll begin here with the discussion of Black doctors. And when I talked with Black doctors about what kinds of diversity initiatives were typically present in their workplaces, they often told me that they were usually subject to cultural competence trainings. And so they described cultural competence trainings as being a class that they had to complete as part of a module, or a seminar that they had to attend, or something that they had to focus on for an hour or two, where the attempt would be to make sure that doctors were aware that patients came from different cultural backgrounds, and that those different cultural backgrounds could potentially have an impact on how patients responded to treatment or the types of interactions that they had with patients. Largely, the doctors with whom I spoke viewed these as unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles. They were not in favor of cultural competence trainings as issues or as programming that had an impact on the things that they experienced. And again, this was largely because these types of trainings seemed very disconnected from the ways that Black doctors saw that race affected their work. And so when I probed into this a little bit more to ask them how they did see race affecting their work and what that looked like, Many Black doctors told me that they did not encounter overt everyday racial aggressions. It wasn't so much that coming to work every day meant that they dealt with what we might think of as microaggressions or hostility from patients or from colleagues. It wasn't that there was this everyday battle in their work life. Rather, they were a lot more likely to tell me that race affected them through structural and cultural processes. And for Black women, interestingly, with race embedded in structural avenues, gender became a much more obvious form of overt bias for them. But none of this was encapsulated in cultural competence training, and none of these experiences were really reflected by the types of initiatives that organizations put forward. So here's a quote from Randy, who is an emergency medicine doctor. And I asked Randy what he thought about the kinds of diversity initiatives that his facility was putting forth, in particular, the kinds of cultural competence trainings that he mentioned were the primary initiative that organizations were enacting. And he actually rolled his eyes at me and said, it's the right idea, but that stuff doesn't mean anything. Nobody takes it seriously. Obviously, I think more diversity is important. It's necessary. But the way they do it, the trainings and modules, it's just one more box to check. They just want quick fixes. Doing the hard work, really changing the profession to get more Black and brown people in here, that's not sexy. So we see here from Randy that this quote illustrates, like many Black doctors told me, that having more diversity in the profession is key and it's important. But doing so through trainings and modules, through the quick fixes, through checking a box, isn't seen as a way that really isn't seen as a strategy that really changes the structural dynamics that underrepresent Black workers and brown workers in the healthcare field in the first place. These are the quick fixes that look good, and they involve organizations being able to say that they're doing something, but that something is usually not viewed by Black doctors as adequate for really changing the demographics of the profession. Here's a quote from Allison, who is a geneticist. And when I spoke with Allison about why she felt that these types of initiatives didn't really have an impact on her work, she again reiterated the statement that the experiences that she had in the workplace were not things that diversity initiatives were designed to address, particularly cultural competence initiatives. But she also reiterated that the challenges that she faced at work were not kind of these overt issues around racial bias or racial harassment that we, I think, frequently think about when we consider the experiences that Black workers have in settings where they're underrepresented. So when Allison told me how race impacted her work, she said, it's impacted my work just because my interests are focused more so on health disparities, medically underserved populations, minorities, those who often do not know about genetic resources or genetic services that are available. And I find it difficult to identify mentors or people who are familiar with those populations, people who are also passionate about educating those populations about genetic services or resources. So I have not really had much luck identifying people who are working with those populations who can help me better address some of the needs or some of the disparities that I see. So this is an important quote because it underscores, again, not only that the challenges that Allison is facing are not challenges that are related to overt instances of bias and harassment, of being the only Black woman in her particular practice or in her particular office. For her, the issues are more so structural problems that by virtue of the underrepresentation of Black workers in healthcare and in medicine, particularly Black workers who want to focus on health disparities, she's less likely to have access to the mentoring, training, and supervision that she needs to succeed in the field. And I would add that this is especially important when we think about how work has changed in the new economy, where people are much less likely to experience upward mobility in one organization and stay with one organization for the course of their careers. Often the way that people experience mobility and hiring and advancement is through the relationships and the networks that they have, which have taken outsized importance in a new economy where there are fewer opportunities for upward mobility in one person's organization, or for one person to stay in one organization for the duration of their career. So when Allison is talking about the lack of mentors and the structural issues that are confronting her, she's really identifying how these structural issues make it that much harder for her to experience mobility and success in the field, despite the fact that these issues are not, again, issues of overt, explicit bias that she faces in the workplace. Edgar, who was an internal medicine doctor, gave me a phrase that I use in the book and actually became a theme for identifying how many Black doctors characterize their experiences with overt bias and overt racial issues. These issues did happen for Black doctors, but they often characterize these kinds of issues as that one-time experience. So as to say, there was that one time when something happened and I didn't like it and this person was super inappropriate with me, but that's not the norm. The real issue for me is that I don't have access to mentors, or that there's a cultural bias around Black doctors so that people expect that I'm going to make mistakes and so forth. So Edgar, in his account of his that one time experience, said, so I can think of one time when I was working in the ER, and God bless him, there was a fellow who came in who was pissed drunk, having chest pains, had no insurance. I'm the only one manning the ER. He comes in and decides he wasn't going to let no N-word doctor take care of him, so he fixed me by getting up and walking out. That was beyond my control. That was his cultural bias that basically put his life on the line. It's extremely rare for me. I think I may have been one of only 2 experiences that I've had in 30-something years of white patients that were negative. So again, I include this important quote because it highlights that while Black doctors do encounter occasional experiences with this kind of explicit and overt racial bias, as Edgar describes, it's usually characterized as a that one time experience. For many Black doctors, they were much more likely to emphasize structural biases like the one that Allison described, or they were likely to describe cultural biases, again, of expectations of Black doctors lacking the skills and capabilities, or being more prone to mistakes and errors, and having less wiggle room if mistakes and errors occurred. That one-time experience did happen, but it was not something that characterized how many Black doctors viewed the issues that they faced in medicine, because typically their racial issues seemed more structural and they seemed more cultural. Now, in that context, a consequence of this was that for many Black women doctors, the structural aspects of racial bias meant that the overt experiences with gender bias that they frequently encountered seemed much more significant and much more salient to characterizing and describing their experiences. Black women doctors were a lot more likely to identify gender biases as something that stood out and that were consistent and routinely a problem for them in the ways that they experienced their everyday work. And very frequently, I think almost to a person, what this meant for Black women doctors was that every Black woman doctor, for one thing, shared the experience of being mistaken for the nurse after identifying themselves as the doctor. This was routine. This happened to pretty much everybody in my study. And so Aisha gives a quote that's an example of this. When she described to me how she felt that gender mattered in more overt ways than race did, she said, because I see my coworkers that are males and the race doesn't matter. If you're male, they will call you a doctor. If you're female, they will call you a nurse. But it's regardless of your race. Like I see my white coworkers, even just because they're female, they still call them nurse. If they're male, they're a doctor. If they're female, they're a nurse. But the race doesn't really matter. It's the male versus female. That's more important than the race. So I include this quote because it gives, I think, some important context to how we understand doctors' experiences with this increased diversity dialogue and why they are so skeptical. Many doctors, I think, viewed themselves as people who doubted the efficacy of these kinds of initiatives, but suspected that the organizations where they worked were well-intentioned. They felt that the hospitals and facilities where they were employed had the right idea in mind, but were executing these initiatives pretty poorly, and that their focus on cultural competence was not very useful because it did not address the types of issues that they genuinely faced. Those issues, again, were largely structural, they were largely cultural, and for Black women doctors, they were gendered in ways that meant that the gender biases that were present in the profession stood front and center and took much more significance than the structural and cultural racial biases that they experienced. But overall, there wasn't a sense that the existing cultural competence trainings that most facilities put into place were really designed to deal with the challenges that Black workers encountered, that Black doctors encountered. There was a very different experience when I spoke with nurses. They were far more skeptical and far more mistrustful of the organizations where they were employed. And for nurses, this was largely because the institutions where they worked often claimed to be diverse places, but these claims were not reflected in nurses' interactions. Unlike doctors, nurses routinely described explicitly racist exchanges with their white colleagues, yet they also observed structural processes that worked to disadvantage Black nurses. And as a consequence, many nurses were far more mistrustful of the diversity rhetoric that their employers and that their organizations offered as a consequence of the different racial realities of their work. So whereas doctors, as I just mentioned, were more likely to think that organizations were well-intentioned but poorly executing these types of initiatives, nurses by and large suspected that the organizations where they were employed put into place diversity rhetoric and language as a way of protecting themselves from legal consequences, but that these organizations had no interest in trying to make concrete changes to create more racial diversity in the nursing profession. And their reason for that was often that they saw the kinds of interactions and challenges that they had. They saw the interpersonal interactions that they had with their colleagues. They saw the structural biases that were in place that disadvantaged Black nurses, and saw that organizations made no move to address either of these. So by way of example, here is Stephen, an orthopedic nurse, and he told me, when you look at the settings, the more people say that they are diverse, the more that they are not diverse. They're diverse on paper because you have to be. But if you're diverse on paper, you ought to be diverse in practice. One cannot go without the other. And when I say that to mean that when you're stating that you are a diverse program, your nursing staff should reflect that. I know one school where in the fall of 2011, they admitted 50 students into the nursing program and none of them were African American. So that was not very representative of what their mission is. So again, we see here the disconnect that nurses like Stephen observe between what organizations say that they want to do versus what actually happens in practice. And for many Black nurses, that disconnect was striking, and it was particularly enlightening in light of the fact, again, that they observed both structural barriers for Black workers interested in the nursing profession, and they dealt with interpersonal challenges that made it difficult for them to do their jobs, but that often went unresolved and unaddressed by management and by the organizations where they were employed. So here's a quote from Janet, who is a pediatric nurse. And Janet was letting me know about some of the structural barriers that she identified in the profession. And she talked particularly about some of the changes in credentialing that were occurring in the nursing profession. And she told me the push is to have all nurses, the entry level, be a Bachelor of Science in Nursing and not community college or diploma programs. So those nurses who do attend community college or diploma programs actually may find that they struggle a little bit more to obtain a job than those with a bachelor's degree. How many Black nurses go to community college because the tuition is less expensive? Or maybe it's a little bit easier to get into the program in terms of just the numbers of people that they accept or the feasibility of having a family and going to a community college. So what Janet is pointing out here is very interesting. It's not that she is making an argument in any way that Black nurses who attend community college or attend these diploma programs lack the qualifications or the skills or the intelligence or the capabilities to be effective, highly qualified nurses. Rather, as the profession is pushing towards more professionalism and higher and changing its standards for credentialing, her argument is that may perhaps unwittingly and perhaps unintentionally have the adverse consequence of reducing the numbers of Black workers who can go into the profession. Again, not because they lack the skill or the talent, but simply because of other existing structural factors that may make it more difficult to get into four-year programs or to spend the time getting the degree that's required from that kind of four-year program, right? So the point here again is that nurses like Janet identified structural barriers that were present for Black nurses in the field, and that these structural barriers were often ones that organizations didn't seem to be doing much to address. Now, in a contrast to what doctors described, nurses were a lot more likely, as I mentioned, to describe many more overt cases of racial bias and harassment. This, in many cases for nurses, was routine. It was frequent. It was something that occurred from peers, from supervisors, and was just a regular part of their work experience. Mindy, who's a mother-baby nurse, told me this. I was just kind of noticing that there was just kind of this demeanor of how dare you be in intensive care because of your race. It never starts out as things that they say right out. They start, some nurses, some white nurses will kind of not say anything, but just kind of, they don't come right out and say it. It's the way that they look at you when you notice these subtle differences. But long story short, someone actually said to me, we were talking about after work, getting together, hanging out, and said, oh, you can come to my house, but you'd have to be carrying a pail and wearing a rag on your head to come to my home. Now, keep in mind, with doctors, these types of interactions rarely came from coworkers, and they were very infrequent. So whereas doctors were more likely to say, well, there was that one time when, in the example of Edgar, this patient decided that they weren't going to let me treat them and they walked out, but that was one time in 30 years and that was a one-off. Nurses were a lot more likely to say to me, how much time do we have for this interview? Because yesterday someone said something to me that was totally inappropriate. And a week ago, I had this situation with my charge nurse where this awful interaction happened. And then 2 weeks before that, there was this other incident with a completely different coworker. Mindy's example here is emblematic of that. Mindy shared this one example that I've quoted here, but this was by far not the only example like this that Mindy described. She had other examples with other coworkers, as did most of the Black nurses that I spoke with in my study. So this gives some insights into why, again, Black nurses in particular had a similarly frustrated take on diversity initiatives as doctors, but for different reasons. They also viewed, like doctors, Black nurses argued that diversity initiatives were unlikely to reflect the experiences that they had. But unlike Black doctors, Black nurses expected that organizations were not focused on actually creating more racial diversity through the initiatives that they put forth, because they saw that when instances like these occurred and when structural changes occurred to make access to the profession more difficult for Black nurses, nothing really happened. Organizations were not motivated to try to make changes to address these very real and significant issues that Black workers were facing. So consequently, nurses were, again, a lot more doubtful about organizations' goodwill and their genuine effort and interest in trying to make these kinds of changes. I'll turn last to the experiences of Black technicians, excuse me, who ironically were most hopeful about diversity initiatives. But again, this was not believed because Black technicians believed that diversity initiatives would be helpful to them. They argued, and research supports their argument, that diversity rhetoric is rarely applied to lower status workers. We typically see arguments about the need for more racial diversity applied to workers who were in higher status positions than technicians. And certainly these types of initiatives were most applied to the nurses and doctors in my study. But technicians also felt that existing diversity policies were not likely to address the hostile racial interactions that they often had with patients and nurses. Rather, their optimism came from their hope and their expectation that these kinds of initiatives might help nurses and doctors to treat patients of color more effectively. So Black technicians held out a hope that even though diversity initiatives were not designed with their experiences in mind, diversity initiatives that doctors and nurses were subject to, in their view, might be helpful in making sure that these healthcare practitioners treated patients of color, and Black patients in particular, more fairly and equitably than they otherwise might be. Here's a quote from Amber, who is a cardiac monitor technician. And Amber told me, "I don't think that it'll impact the work that I do just because of my minimal patient contact that I have. But as far as everyone else, I do believe that it'll impact them. I'm thinking of the nurses and doctors that are being trained. It might make them go a little bit more of the extra mile to make sure everyone is comforted and kind of on the same level. Of course, they always go the extra mile, but now it's just adding another key role." So we see here from Amber that there's not the expectation that diversity training is going to have a direct impact on her. Her patient contact is minimal. It's not that she's the subject of these kinds of diversity trainings, but in her role as a technician, she has experience and she has seen ways that Black workers and Black patients get treated differently. The expectation and the hope is that with some diversity training in place, Black nurses and doctors may be more likely and more able to treat Black patients and other patients of color in a fashion that takes into consideration racial dynamics. And finally, I'll include here a quote from Callie, a patient care technician. And I include Callie's quote here because this gives insights into the kinds of challenges that technicians face, sometimes from patients and their families, and the ways in which these challenges, again, are not designed to be addressed by existing diversity initiatives that don't take patients' experiences they don't take technicians' experiences into consideration. Callie told me, "Okay, so not too long ago, I had this patient and I came to her room to get her baby. It was time to do the baby vitals and to do the PKU on the baby, and her family was in there. Her dad was in there. So when I came in, I did her vitals, and then I asked her, could I take the baby? And I told her I would be back in about 10 minutes. And her dad started going off because she was handing me the baby, and he was like, what are you doing? And she was like, oh, Dad, please don't start. And he was like, you don't know who she is. She's just coming in here grabbing the baby, and she could be anyone. Look at her. I looked at him, and I'm like, well, here's my badge. My badge had flipped around, so I turned it around, and he was like, that's the problem here. They'll let anyone work here. You people are lucky to be here. So again, we see an example from Callie that's a pretty stark difference from what many Black doctors described facing, and is in fact more along the lines of what Black nurses described experiencing in the workplace. But Callie's experiences, like that of Black nurses, indicate that technicians are a bit more doubtful about the efficacy of the initiatives that are put into place, because these initiatives are not designed for people like Callie in mind, or not designed with people like Callie in mind. They are not designed to address the challenges that Black technicians are encountering with patients' family members who can treat them in hostile and demeaning ways. Given that, it's unsurprising perhaps that Black technicians are doubtful that these kinds of diversity initiatives are going to address their own experiences, even as they hold out hope that diversity initiatives in place for nurses and doctors can mean that patients don't get treated in the same way that they do, or that patients of color are able to escape certain kinds of mistreatment from practitioners. So I'll conclude here with a few key points. I've argued here that based on the existing research, we know that mainstream diversity talk is one example of work transformation in the new economy. It is now far more common for organizations to profess their commitment to diversity and to say that this is something that matters to them and that this is something that they value. But as I've tried to show here, what diversity actually means depends on occupational status. What diversity means to doctors is not what diversity means to nurses, and what diversity means to nurses is not necessarily what it means to technicians. But I can say that across the board, diversity initiatives that are currently in place rarely reflect the racial realities that Black professionals encounter in the new economy. These racial realities are driven by both structural and interpersonal factors, and they vary by occupation and have gender dimensions. But across those variations, what we do see is that this aspect of work transformation is largely leaving Black professionals disillusioned and disengaged. Now, because I always try to end presentations on a high note and not leaving people depressed and feeling bad about the things that I've said, I do think that there are some implications here that are hopeful and optimistic, and that there is some reason for optimism based on this research. And primarily, the reason that I say that is that the workers in the study, I think, have provided a blueprint for organizations that are serious and do want to think more critically and comprehensively about how they can really address the issues that workers of color are facing in their settings and in their context. Part of the disconnect, as I've mentioned, comes from the fact that organizational issues around racial diversity frequently seemed divorced and decontextualized from what Black workers experience. But I think that for organizations that do want to focus more on addressing the challenges that Black workers and their employ are dealing with, a key finding and a key implication from this work is to start by addressing the challenges that those Black workers are encountering and making sure that organizations are attuned to how those challenges vary, again, by occupational status, by gender, and to avoid painting with a too generalizable brush that assumes that Black workers all share the same workplace experiences. I think that for organizations that are serious about taking those steps, there's room for improvement and room for hope that those kinds of changes will lead to more optimistic outcomes for Black workers that are employed in these organizational settings, and that they can potentially achieve the diversity that they say that they want. So I'll stop here and end the screen share. And at this point, I'm happy to take questions, comments, or any points for discussion anyone would like to raise. Thank you.
Adia, thank you so much for your information, and your presentation is very, very interesting. And the question that I'd like to pose as we invite the audience to put their questions in the chat is, in your research, as you embarked upon your research and writing your book, did you start off with a specific hypothesis? And if so, did the findings surprise you?
So that's a great question. I started off generally wanting to understand kind of how these changes to the new economy were affecting Black workers. But I will say that I was surprised by how much variance there was between occupations and how different workers' experiences were, depending on whether they were doctors, whether they were nurses, whether they were technicians. I certainly was very surprised, based on a lot of what we know from the existing literature, to find so many doctors saying that they didn't encounter kind of these daily racial micro or macro aggressions. But I found it really telling and very interesting that they were very clear that they weren't trying to make an argument that race had ceased to matter and that it was no longer a factor for them, but more so that it mattered in ways that perhaps were being overlooked by a lot of the existing literature and research, and that these issues around structure and culture were really much more salient to them than an environment where they went to work every day to deal with the kinds of unfortunate racial microaggressions that nurses dealt with.
Thank you. And another question, and there is a raised hand, so I'm going to ask Iris, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, because we can't acknowledge the raised hand because you're muted. But Dr. Wingfield, will you tell me, related to the rhetoric that we heard from the Trump administration, if you were to ask the same questions that you asked previously in your interviews, do you think that the rhetoric, quote unquote, the rhetoric of the cultural competence, the responses might be different?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I think that the responses around cultural competence in particular would be different, but I think that respondents would amplify some of the structural challenges that are present for them, particularly now as the COVID crisis has laid bare a lot of the fractures and the weaknesses in our healthcare system, and the way in which it's been underserved in ways that would allow many of our healthcare workers to be better able to prepare for and deal with and respond to this current crisis. So I'm not sure that Black healthcare workers, were I to re-interview them today, would argue that cultural competence perhaps is more useful than they had viewed before, or that it has more utility than perhaps they had viewed before. But I think that they would be more attuned to some of the when I talked before about the healthcare system being a tiered system and the shift between the public system of care and the private system of care. I think that a lot more respondents would identify the implications of that and what that means for Black workers trying to navigate these settings, and how those implications of this tiered system have become a lot more stark and a lot more glaringly obvious to us as we're all reeling with and we see our healthcare system buckling under the consequences of this pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's a question in the chat that the ask is, have healthcare institutions been receptive to your research?
So thus far, yes, I wasn't quite sure what to expect from these findings and from sharing these with healthcare institutions and healthcare workers. It was important to me to do that because I did want people in the healthcare industry to know about the work and to be aware of the findings and the data that I had. But yes, thus far, I've been very fortunate to have gotten very receptive and non-defensive responses in the cases where I've presented the work.
That's excellent. And a last question in the chat so far. Do you know if minorities have been, let me see, I'm losing it. Are minorities often involved, if you can tell, in the planning of diversity initiatives and cultural competence training program content? Is that one of the missteps that you recognize? That there's
Yes, that's a fantastic question.
Okay.
And from what I have found, typically, well, so for one thing, when we talk about cultural competence training, it's very inconsistent and it's very patchy, right? Organizations are not required to do that. They make a choice and a decision to do that. And there's no kind of uniform federal standard of what that kind of training may look like. So one, organizations can adopt it voluntarily, and what one organization adopts may look very different from what another organization adopts, right? There's not a uniform standard or baseline around what gets utilized. But what I have found is that typically, no, people of color are not involved in, at least I'll say this, people of color who are workers at the institution are typically not involved in whether and how those trainings get implemented and what the content is of those trainings. And this is something that I talk about in the book in a lot more detail, because what I find is that with diversity initiatives that many workers find substandard or ill-equipped to meet the pressing needs that they encounter, many workers of color end up doing this work on their own. And I argue that that in itself presents a problem, because ultimately then what you have are people who are doing an additional job on top of the job that they were actually hired to do, and finding themselves in a situation where they're doing a lot more uncompensated, unacknowledged labor that is very beneficial to the organization, but that doesn't get the recognition and the support that it needs and deserves.
Okay. I'm going to see if I can summarize this very well outlined question, but the bottom line of this question is it correct to say that your findings show that holding a higher authority in healthcare allows patients to overlook race?
Just holding a higher authority in healthcare allow patients to overlook race? I would say not necessarily. And the reason I say that, and I talk about this in the book too, is that I think that it's not so much that doctors are in a position where their higher position means that patients overlook their race. I think that the structure of how healthcare is organized means that doctors are in a position where they experience a certain structure that shapes their work very differently than nurses and technicians, right? So if you think about, if you're in a position where you are fortunate enough to have private insurance, if you think about how your doctor's visit goes, right? You go to your doctor. First, you're probably going to wait for a while, and then you're seen by a technician or a nurse, and then the doctor is the last person that you see. And in many cases, the doctor is the person that you see for the least amount of time, right? So for one thing, I think that Black doctors have less time with patients than I think nurses and technicians do. And I think that's a function not necessarily of their status, but of how we've organized the healthcare system today. But I also think that Black doctors benefit in some ways from the current organization of healthcare, particularly this production of healthcare as a consumptive good rather than a right, because what that means is that people actually, if you have private insurance, are in a position where they're often able to choose their doctors, right? So I think that Black doctors actually benefit from some self-selection, because I think that people who are that opposed and that adamantly determined that they simply will not see a Black doctor, in many cases, if they have private insurance, can avoid doing that, right? They can go online, they can see who they want to be their doctor. And if they are that determined that they would never be treated by a Black doctor, they simply bypass that person and they can see someone who's not a Black doctor. And I actually had respondents who would tell me that they had patients who were white who specifically wanted to work with them because they wanted to send a message to their kids, and they wanted to be able to say, look, we're seeing this Black doctor because I want to send a message about racial inclusiveness and who belongs in your circle and so forth. So I think it's not the doctors who were least likely to say that they had very few interpersonal interactions with racial biases were emergency medicine doctors. And I think that's because emergency medicine doctors represent kind of this field of medicine where patients have the least control over whether they see that doctor or not, right? When I talked to emergency medicine doctors, they were more like nurses. They were like, oh no, this stuff happens all the time. People walk out on me, they use racial slurs, they use the N-word, it's crazy, it's just constant barrages of hostility. But I think that's because they represent this form of medicine where if you go to the emergency room, I mean, it's an emergency, you're not in your best place anyway, but also you get whoever's on staff, and you don't get to decide that you're not going to see a Black doctor unless you're willing to go back out into the waiting room and wait for another 8 or 12 hours for the next doctor to come on shift, which does happen sometimes to emergency medicine doctors. So all that to say, I would not argue that, based on my data, I don't think that Black doctors are at a point where their status allows them to avoid racial biases. I think that the way that medicine is organized actually puts them in a position where they benefit from self-selection in many cases that allows them to sidestep some of those issues that are still there, especially for their colleagues who are emergency medicine doctors.
I'll ask you one last question, then turn it over to my colleague, Janet. My daughter is an RN pursuing her NP. So this question connects with me. For students of color pursuing nurse and tech certifications, do you have recommendations for how you would prepare them for situations that were experienced by those you interviewed?
That's another great question as well. And it's it is a little difficult to answer. And the reason I say that is because, and some of this reflects my view as a social scientist and my focus as a sociologist, but one of the most frustrating parts of this study was that there were so many respondents who tried to come up with strategies and ways to resolve these kinds of issues. But ultimately, in my view, these are issues that the organization should be solving. We should not have organizations that allow their workers to be mistreated like this. It is unconscionable, in my view, that there can be facilities where people go to work to experience racist harassment from patients, from their colleagues. That's insane and completely unacceptable. So I'm 100% sympathetic to people who are in nursing programs and technical programs who are thinking, what can I do to try to address these issues? And how can I deal with these issues when they arise? I, again, am so sympathetic to that challenge, but I also think this should not be up to you to have to solve those problems, right? And I don't know if it's necessarily a case that collective bargaining or union work, and this is the point that I make in the conclusion, this is part of the appeal of unions and collective bargaining, because unions are supposed to be collectively representing workers as a group so that individual people aren't trying to solve these problems. But we also know that unions have had their challenges and had their problems as well, right? They're not a panacea. They don't solve all problems. So I think I would suggest, to the extent that it's possible, for people who are nurses of color or technicians of color pursuing these fields, to the extent that it is possible to work collectively to pressure organizations to adapt policies, to adapt rules, to adapt ways of thinking about how to be attuned to the challenges that all workers of color are facing, not just doctors, because I think that's also a tendency to focus on people who are the most visible and the most highly paid and the most well represented in the profession. But I think to the extent that it's possible to gather support from a wide group and to push organizations to develop strategies and policies to address these issues, I really think that's the critical way of resolving these, because it should not be your job as the technician to say, I shouldn't be treated like this. The organization should be protecting you so that you're never treated like that, because nobody should experience that kind of work environment. And again, if organizations are saying that they're really committed to diversity, guess what? Being committed to diversity means that you have to protect and acknowledge the experiences that your workers are facing, and you can't leave them hung out to dry like this. So longer than I meant to, that was a longer answer than I meant to give, but I think it's really important to highlight that these are changes that have to happen on an organizational level, not on a scattered interpersonal level.
Very well put, and thank you for that. Policies and how they're observed certainly is one element of culture. It's an element of culture that's documented. It can be something that you observe. I'm going to try to, for a last question, poll something that Ashley asked in the chat, was something that I was curious about. Ashley's wondering reading suggestions if she wants to dive deeper, and I'm wondering, which this might relate to reading, but it might not be. If we're talking about cultural competency, one-off check the box trainings are not really getting it done. It's a change of culture that holds people accountable for their behavior, that begins to move the needle. Are there examples you can cite of things that give you hope, that you think there's a good approach? Are there resources that you would want to point us to for how this is being done well? Because it seems like it's being done pretty weakly in a lot of corners.
Yeah, so every time I present this work, someone always asks me, can you point to a place that's doing this right, that you consider a model that's doing a good job? I unfortunately don't have examples of that. And that's not to say that they're not out there, right? But I will just say that from my interviewing and data collection, I didn't come across any respondents who kind of would say, yes, my organization has got a lock on this and we're doing a great job, and here's what we're doing and here's why we're doing a great job on these issues. But I will say that there is a lot of research from people in my field. Ellen Berry is a person who's focused on the research on diversity initiatives and how they have fallen flat in many cases. Frank Dobbin is another colleague of mine who's done a lot of good work in this area. But these researchers make points that, again, a great deal of these problems are the fact that organizations employ policies and structures and cultural dynamics that are basically not suited to a 21st century multiracial workforce, and that organizations have to go about making a lot of changes to how they hire, to how they promote people, to how they put people on teams in order for them to better reflect the workforces that they have today. So I don't know if I can point to an example of a facility and organization where I would say, yes, they've got it. But I think that organizations, again, if you're going to say that you want to be focused on diversity, if you're going to say that this is a thing that you really want to see happen, you can't conduct your organization the same way and with the same paths and patterns that you have been using for the last however many years. This is a different world, it's a different environment, and it's a different workforce, and your changes have to reflect that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your findings with us, for taking so many of the questions. We are at time, so before we close out, I'd love to offer you an opportunity to give a closing comment to the group.
I just want to thank everybody for attending. I wish I could have gotten to all of the questions in the chat, but time did not permit. But thank you everyone for attending and taking time out of your day to listen to me talk about my work.
Well, thank you so much for sharing it with us. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Thank you to my co-hostess with the mostest, Cynthia, for making these programs such a pleasure to do. Wishing everybody happy, healthy, and safe out there. We hope to see you again at an open classroom again sometime soon. Be well, everybody. Goodbye now.